The year was 2012, and the world was obsessed with the apocalypse that never came. For 23-year-old Elias Vance, a computer engineering dropout with an unhealthy caffeine addiction and a room full of salvaged radio equipment, the real end of the world felt less like a fiery cataclysm and more like an endless, echoing silence that he lived in the attic of his late grandmother's dilapidated Queen and in the coastal town of Seabrook, Maine, a place where the fog was as thick as a woolen blanket and the local news was mostly about missing lobster traps. Elias was a listener. Not a true crime podcast addict or a suburban gossip, but a dedicated amateur radio operator, or ham, with a specific, solitary pursuit, deep sky audio. He listened to the cosmos, the static, the white noise of an uncaring universe. One frigid November night, the salt-laced wind rattling the attic window panes, Elias was running a newly calibrated, custom-built receiver, a Frankenstein's monster of copper wire, vacuum tubes, and old military surplus components. He was scanning the low-frequency bands, hoping to catch some atmospheric disturbance, a distant pulsar, anything to justify the $8,000 and countless sleepless nights he'd poured into his hobby. Around 3:17 a.m., the air in the attic, which had been a steady, comforting hiss of static, abruptly snapped. That it wasn't a sudden, jarring noise like a burst of radio chatter. It was a precise, perfectly modulated signal. It cut through the noise with the crystalline clarity of a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. Elias almost spilled his third cup of cold coffee. That it was a burst of sound that lasted exactly 1.4 seconds. That he sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The signal was impossible to place. It wasn't human speech, wasn't Morse code, wasn't a known military or weather beacon. It sounded like a fusion of two distinct things, a highly advanced, mathematically complex digital data stream, layered over what could only be described as a biological signature. A sound like a deep, wet inhale that faded into a rush of white noise, followed by an unnervingly clear click. Elias scrambled for the record button on his old Tascam recorder. The sound was gone, replaced by the familiar blanket of static. He replayed the 1.4 seconds. The digital stream was alien, but the biological component, the heavy, sucking breath, was disturbingly close, intimate. That he spent the next 2 weeks running spectral analyses on the tiny clip. The digital code defied all known encryption or encoding standards. The biological noise was just as baffling. It had a rhythmic, almost tidal quality, like the sound of a massive, submerged lung expanding. But the most unsettling discovery was the frequency drift. Most signals from deep space exhibit a Doppler shift, a natural change in frequency as the source moves relative to Earth. This signal, however, corrected its own drift in real time. That it wasn't a random celestial event. It was actively tracking him. Elias tried to share the data. He uploaded the clip to obscure ham radio forums, to astrophysics message boards, even to a few late-night crypto-sleuth channels. The responses ranged from a new digital echo sounder from a Russian sub to "you accidentally recorded your own HVAC system." No one took the biological components seriously. No one else had a receiver capable of picking up the clean signal before the atmosphere chewed it up. He realized he was alone with his discovery. Over the next month, the signals came again. Not every night, not even every week, but always precisely at 3:17 a.m. Each one was 1.4 seconds long, each one contained the same impossibly complex digital data, and each one concluded with that wet, heavy inhale and that sharp, deliberate click. Then came December 24th, Christmas Eve. The attic was unusually still, the temperature dropping fast. Elias, driven by a gnawing sense of obligation, was at his desk. At 3:17 a.m., the signal came. But this time, it wasn't 1.4 seconds. It was a sustained, continuous broadcast. The digital component was there, screaming through the receiver. But the biological sound was different. The inhale was deeper, closer, like the thing that made it was right outside the window. And the click, it was no longer a solitary punctuation mark. It was a series of rapid, rhythmic clicks, like a fingernail tapping against hard glass, but there was a new layer. A new element that froze the blood in Elias's veins. A sound that wasn't a code, wasn't a breath, and wasn't a tap. It was a sound that was impossible to mistake, delivered in the precise vocal cadence of a human being, but warped and stretched across the light years of space. It was his own voice. It was Elias, speaking a single word he hadn't thought of in 20 years, his voice muffled, slowed, and choked with a sound like water rushing into a confined space, the word, Mom. The transmission ended abruptly, the static rushing back like a wave washing over sand. Elias sat perfectly still, the sound of his grandmother's old clock on the mantel suddenly deafening. His heart had stopped beating that he knew that word. It was the last thing he'd whispered when he was 3, trapped in the crawlspace beneath his house after a game of hide-and-seek gone wrong, before his father found him. A memory that only he had. Elias backed slowly away from the desk, his hands shaking so violently he knocked his coffee mug onto the floor. The ceramic shattered, the black liquid spreading like a stain. He looked up at the window, the old glass distorted by the freezing fog outside, and saw a dark shape, not the tree, not the moon, a perfect, immense shadow that slid across the pane, and in the silence of the attic, Elias heard, unmistakably, a final, wet inhale coming not from his headphones, but from the other side of the glass, and a click. A single, distinct, bone-jarring click that came from inside the house. Elias didn't move for what felt like an hour, though the grandfather clock downstairs only ticked 12 times. The shadow outside the attic window was gone, and the shattering sound of the coffee mug seemed to have swallowed all other noise. He was paralyzed, staring at the shattered ceramic and the dark pool of coffee, which looked like spilled crude oil. The final click from inside the house echoed in his memory, a sound of mechanical finality. It wasn't a floorboard groaning or a house settling, it was sharp, synthetic, and it had been close. Too close. His technical mind, the one that had spent a decade dissecting radio waves, screamed for a rational explanation. Subliminal audio spliced into the data stream. A sophisticated, highly personalized prank. But the voice was too perfect, too deeply buried in his childhood. And the click, he forced himself to move, grabbing the old, heavy-duty flashlight beside his desk. He shone the beam around the cramped attic, tracing the dusty beams and the moth-eaten insulation. Nothing. The door to the stairwell was still closed, the brass handle cold and untouched. He knew he should call the police, but what would he say? A radio signal from space is impersonating my 3-year-old self, and now something is clicking in my dead grandmother's house. They'd put him on a psych hold. He looked back at his equipment. The Tascam recorder was still running, capturing the dead air. He rewound the tape and hit play. The sustained broadcast was even more horrifying on playback. The digital scream sounded like 1,000,000 dying hard drives. The biological inhale was a tidal wave of suction. And then, his voice, that slow, watery Mom, followed by the machine gun clicks. He paused the tape, his thumb hovering over the rewind button. The source of the transmission had corrected its frequency drift to an impossibly precise degree. It wasn't just tracking Earth, it was locked onto the house. And now it had used a sound only Elias should have known. It was learning, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and pure, blinding terror. Elias made a decision that would later define the nightmare. He decided to transmit a reply. He powered up the old, tube-driven transmitter, a piece of vintage equipment nicknamed the burner, because of the sheer power it could push. He wasn't going to send a verbal message, he was going to send a tone. A simple, clean 700 Hz sine wave, a universal, hello, in the language of radio. He worked quickly, his breath fogging the air. He tuned the transmitter to the exact low-frequency band of the incoming signal, then connected a small, specialized, directional antenna he kept mounted on a tripod pointed out the window. If the signal was outside, this would hit IT at 3:45 a.m., he was ready. He flipped the transmit switch, the attic lights flickered violently. The tubes on the burner glowed with a terrifying, white-hot intensity. The sound of the 700 Hz tone, monitored through a shielded speaker, was loud, clean, and aggressive. Elias held the key down for exactly 1.4 seconds, mimicking the original burst that he released the key and immediately switched the system back to receive. Silence. Only the gentle hiss of static. He waited, adrenaline pumping. He waited 10 minutes. Then 20. The sun would be up in a couple of hours. Maybe he had scared it off. Just as the tension started to ease, the radio in his headset exploded with a sound that physically hurt that it wasn't 3:17 a.m. It was 4:11 a.m. The routine was broken, the incoming signal was no longer 1.4 seconds. It was infinite, the digital component was there, but the complexity was overwhelming the receiver, turning it into a wall of high-pitched noise. The biological inhale was replaced by a continuous, sucking roar, like standing inside a wind tunnel with an open mouth. The rhythm of the clicks had accelerated to a frenzied, chattering blur, and a voice that it wasn't his single, choked word this time. It was a torrent that it was Elias's grandmother, the one who had died in this very house 5 years prior. Her voice, clear but overlaid with the same watery distortion, was reciting his childhood prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. The sound filled the attic, crushing the air out of his lungs. Elias tore the headphones from his head, throwing them against the wall. The sound immediately began to bleed through the unshielded wires of his equipment, filling the room. He backed up, stumbling over a coil of coaxial cable. He looked at the antenna, the small, directional dish he had pointed out the window. The broadcast stopped as abruptly as it began. In the ensuing silence, the sound came from directly in front of him. A wet, sloppy noise, followed by a series of deliberate, heavy taps on the wood of the floor, right outside the attic door. Then, through the wood, came the final, devastating sound. Not a word, but a simple, terrifying realization. The voice, a perfect imitation of his grandmother's strained, arthritic sigh, whispered 3 words that chilled him to the bone. You let me in. The door handle to the attic began to turn, slowly, silently, with the distinct, metallic click of the latch disengaging. Elias didn't wait for the door to open. The finality of those 3 whispered words, you let me in, coupled with the mechanical certainty of the turning doorknob, dissolved any remaining doubt or scientific curiosity. This was not a signal, this was a pursuit. And his broadcast had given it the final coordinates. He launched himself across the small attic space, stumbling over the remnants of his shattered coffee mug. His goal was the single, small window at the back of the house, overlooking the fog-shrouded yard. It was old, painted shut, and secured by 2 rusty latches. The doorknob stopped turning. Silence. Then, a slow, scraping sound, as if something immense was being dragged across the landing outside. Elias yanked at the first window latch. It was fused to the frame. He tried the second, his fingers numb with panic and cold. It gave way with a screech of rusted metal that sounded deafening in the silence. He leaned back, planting his feet, and kicked the base of the window. The ancient wood around the frame splintered, but the glass held. He kicked again, harder, putting his entire weight into the strike. The wood groaned, and the sash gave way with a shriek of tearing plaster. Swinging inward, the sudden blast of frigid Maine air hit him, thick with the smell of pine and the overwhelming, metallic tang of the nearby ocean. He scrambled over the sill just as the attic door began to splinter. The first blow wasn't a kick, it was a press. The wood of the door didn't burst, it bowed inward, a deep, sickening creak preceding a tearing sound. Elias dropped out of the window, landing hard on the mossy shingles of the steep roof pitch. The drop was 15 feet to the ground, too far for a clean jump. He scrambled, grabbing hold of the gutter, ignoring the pain in his wrists. From the hole where the attic window had been, a sound emerged. It was not a roar or a shriek. It was a single, long, wet sigh, the sound of relief, of arrival. He risked a glance back. Nothing visible yet, but the silhouette of the window was now framed by something that wasn't wood. It was a dark, oily sheen, moving with an unnatural, viscous fluidity. He swung himself down, his feet searching for the gutter drainage pipe. He found it and slid down the rough metal, tearing the skin on his palms. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto the lawn, the impact stunning him for a crucial second. He was in the backyard, surrounded by the towering, skeletal silhouettes of winter trees. The fog was everywhere, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. The front door was too far, too risky. He turned and ran toward the back gate, his mind racing. The entity, whatever it was intelligent, adaptive, and able to imitate human voices from a distance. Now it was here. He fumbled with the rusted padlock on the back gate. His hands, still raw from the fall, wouldn't cooperate. Frustration morphed into raw terror. From the roof above, he heard a sound, the heavy, rhythmic taps that had preceded the opening of the attic door. Not on the floor, but on the shingles, descending the steep pitch. Tap. 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 Slow. Deliberate. Heavy. Elias abandoned the gate and scrambled toward the darkest corner of the yard, the dilapidated woodshed, leaning precariously against an ancient oak. The lock on the shed was a simple hook and eye. He ripped the door open and dove inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The shed was a claustrophobic box filled with the scent of dried leaves and gasoline. He pressed his back against the rough wood, trying to silence his ragged breathing. The tapping stopped, silence returned, absolute and paralyzing. The kind of silence that suggests a predator has paused, listening not with ears, but with an immense, primal concentration. Then, a new sound, coming from just outside the shed door. It was low, wet, and scraping, like 1,000 slugs moving over rough concrete. Then, the voice. It wasn't his grandmother this time. It was a younger voice, gentle, melodic, and sickeningly familiar. It was the voice of Chloe, his high school crush, who had died in a boating accident 10 years ago, an event that had sent Elias into his reclusive existence. The voice was perfect. No distortion, no watery effect. It was just Chloe, right outside the thin wall of the shed. Elias? I know you're in there. Please, you shouldn't have sent the tone. It thinks you want to play now. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. Not real. Not real. It's cold, Elias. And it's looking for the machine you used. You know, the one that clicked back. I can help you hide it. I can help you, go back to sleep. The voice paused. And then, slowly, deliberately, the sound of his antique radio equipment being systematically destroyed began. The heavy thud of the transmitter being tipped over. The shattering crack of vacuum tubes being crushed. The slow, rhythmic squeal of the Tascam tape being unwound and torn apart. The sounds were coming from the attic, far above. It can hear the echo of your fear, Elias, Chloe's voice whispered, now impossibly close to the woodshed door. And it loves the silence after the noise. It needs you to be quiet. Elias opened his eyes. He saw a sliver of darkness through a crack in the woodshed wall. Something moved past the crack. It was a deep, charcoal black, a color that seemed to absorb the fog around it. It moved with a smooth, sickening undulation. He backed away, his foot kicking a small, heavy object. He looked down. It was a rusty hatchet, used for splitting kindling that he picked it up, the cold steel a heavy, reassuring anchor in his hand. Elias. The voice called, softer now, right outside the door. Let me show you where the signal really came from. It was here the whole time. Just waiting for someone to listen. A thin, dark line began to appear where the woodshed door met the frame. It was a sticky, viscous fluid, black and shimmering. As Elias watched, the fluid began to seep inward, pooling at the threshold, spreading with a life of its own. Then, the final, chilling noise, the sound of a human tongue making a small, satisfied, sucking sound, right on the other side of the wood. Elias raised the hatchet, his knuckles white. Elias raised the hatchet, but before he could swing, a section of the woodshed wall directly to his right exploded inward. Not a violent, shattering break, but a clean, sudden rupture. The wood didn't splinter, it seemed to dissolve, leaving a hole roughly the size and shape of a human torso. Through the opening, a rush of cold air and that overwhelming, metallic oceanic stench flooded the shed. But there was no physical form immediately visible. Only the undulating, charcoal-black residue that coated the edges of the jagged hole. The voice of Chloe vanished. It was replaced by a sound that vibrated the very air in the small enclosure, a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a ship's engine far beneath the waterline, coupled with a wet, heavy squelch that suggested impossible weight being shifted. Elias reacted instinctively. He plunged the hatchet into the ground, scrambling to the opposite corner of the shed. He scanned the floor, remembering his childhood. His grandmother's house, and every outbuilding on the property, had a crawlspace access point, a relic of New England building codes that he founded, a small, square section of loose-fitting floorboard, barely big enough for a raccoon, tucked under a pile of rusted gardening tools. The thrumming intensified. The hole in the wall began to expand, the edges liquefying and dripping the black, oily substance onto the concrete floor. The light filtering through the crack in the door suddenly dimmed as something vast moved directly outside the shed. Elias dropped the hatchet and tore at the floorboard. It was heavy, and the hinges groaned in protest. He managed to lift it just enough to squeeze through. He dropped down, landing on his hands and knees in the cold, damp earth of the crawlspace. The air down here was musty, thick with the smell of mold and forgotten things. He pulled the wooden access panel shut over his head, plunging himself into absolute, suffocating darkness. That he lay still, his breath sawing in the close air, listening. Above him, the floorboards of the woodshed creaked, groaning under a tremendous, settling weight. The scraping sound returned, much louder, much heavier. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose across the shed floor, directly to where Elias had been standing moments before. Then, a new sound, one that made Elias clamp his hands over his ears, a sound that shouldn't exist. It was the digital component of the signal, the mathematically complex data stream, now being audibly transcribed. It sounded like a million tiny, perfectly synchronized glass shards colliding inside a metal drum, a deafening, high-frequency scream that cut through the wood and earth. The screaming stopped as quickly as it started. The floorboard above his head shifted. A slow, agonizing creak, then, a sound that confirmed his worst fears. A sound that had no mouth, no lung, no larynx, but was perfectly capable of mimicry. A quiet, distorted thump-thump. The sound of his own racing heart, played back through the wood. The scraping weight moved directly over him. Then came the voice, a new one. This was not a familiar voice from his past. It was a projection of his own deepest, most shameful inner monologue, the one he kept locked away. It was full of self-loathing, doubt, and paralyzing regret. You knew it was real, Elias. You listened too closely. The deep sky isn't just silence. It's a vacuum that needs to be filled. And you called it. A thin, dark stream of the black, oily substance began to seep through the seams of the floorboard directly above his head, dripping onto the earth a few inches from his face. It knows about the antenna you built. It knows the frequency. It knows about your listening sickness. Your beautiful, lonely little hobby. The substance was cold, and as it hit the dirt, the earth began to hiss and smoke faintly. Elias knew he couldn't stay. The thing was not physically limited by the shed. It was fluid, and it was aware that he began to crawl, silent and low, deeper into the narrow, dark tunnel of the crawlspace, heading blindly toward the main house foundation. The dirt was cold, wet, and unforgiving. As he crawled, he heard the floorboard above him tear open with a sickening rip. And immediately, the entire crawlspace was illuminated, not by a beam of light, but by a diffuse, sickening internal glow. He risked a glance back. Hanging through the ripped-open floor of the woodshed was a massive, amorphous shape, radiating a cold, chemical luminescence. It had no discernible face or limbs, but where its body met the wood, a complex, geometric pattern of perfectly articulated, crystalline teeth was growing, dissolving the wood around it, and from that glowing center, the last sound before Elias pushed himself into a panicked sprint, a series of rapid, frenzied clicks, followed by an utterly alien, high-pitched noise, the pure, untranslated signal. That was the sound of a perfect, horrifying laughter. Elias scrambled forward, driven by the absolute certainty that the thing behind him was no ghost or cryptid. It was an apex predator that had been waiting for a doorbell to ring. He crawled on his belly, navigating the maze of concrete support pillars and ancient, crumbling brickwork beneath his grandmother's house. The air grew colder, the scent of earth and rot intensified. The glowing shape was too large to follow him immediately, but the sound it emitted, that sharp, frenzied clicking overlaid with its cold, crystalline laughter, filled the narrow space, amplifying the terror. He focused on the single, most critical piece of knowledge. The house had a deep, dry stone basement beneath the main living room, accessible only by a sealed hatch in the floor. If he could reach the house's main foundation wall, he could cut through an old coal chute and get inside. As he reached the cinder-block foundation, the laughter behind him abruptly cut out. It was replaced by a rapid, wet slithering sound, coming from both the left and the right, closing the distance along the wall. The amorphous entity was dissolving its mass into smaller, faster-moving components. Elias pressed himself against the rough concrete, his breath held tight. The slithering stopped, then, he heard a new noise, a meticulous sound of observation. Sniff. 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 The sound was coming from inches away, directly on the other side of the foundation wall. It was the sound of air being drawn across a dry surface, highly magnified and distorted. It was smelling him through the concrete, and then, his grandmother's voice, thin and strained, as if struggling to be heard from inside a glass jar. Elias, the basement, don't go into the basement. It's been waiting, for the lock to break. The voice vanished, replaced by a deep, guttural groan that resonated through the foundation, vibrating Elias's skull. He located the coal chute, an ancient, square opening sealed decades ago with a thick plywood board and a rusted padlock. He pulled at the board. It was solid. He remembered the hatchet. He'd dropped it near the woodshed entrance. Panic set in. He was trapped between a solid concrete wall and a closing, invisible pincer movement. Then, his foot struck something heavy in the dirt. He reached down, fingers closing around a forgotten artifact, a heavy, crescent-shaped monkey wrench left by his grandfather. It was crude, heavy steel, a weapon, or a tool. He didn't hesitate. He slammed the wrench against the padlock on the coal chute. The sound was a jarring, metallic clang that echoed violently in the confined space. A split second later, the ground beneath Elias began to shake. The slithering sound coalesced into a loud, fast rush from both ends of the crawlspace, converging on his position. He hit the padlock again, shattering the cheap, rusted mechanism. The wrench slipped from his hand, lost in the dirt. He ripped the plywood board away. The opening led into a short, vertical chute, smelling of dust and centuries of undisturbed air. Elias pushed himself into the narrow opening, scrambling upward. He didn't look back as he reached the top of the chute, plunging into the darkness of the basement. The cinder-block wall behind him cracked with a sound like a gunshot that he landed on the cold concrete floor of the basement, staggering upright. He was in a vast, dry, silent space, a low-ceilinged chamber filled with shadows and the ghostly shapes of furniture draped in white cloth. The air was dead, motionless that he turned toward the chute entrance. The shattered plywood lay on the floor. From the hole, a high-pitched, rapidly escalating whine began. It wasn't the digital code, it was a sound of pure, sonic vibration, intense enough to make his teeth hurt. Then, a single, black tendril, impossibly smooth and glistening, snaked out of the hole, tapping the concrete floor. It was about the thickness of a garden hose, but its movement was purposeful, almost exploratory. The tendril retracted instantly, and the voice of Elias's childhood crush, Chloe, returned, but laced with a new, terrifying authority. It doesn't like the stone. The foundation is too deep for the whole mass. But it knows you're scared of the dark, Elias. We'll turn the lights on. We'll find a better frequency. Elias watched in horror as, one by one, the basement's single bare light bulbs, suspended from the rafters, began to flicker on, not from a switch being flipped, but from some unseen, power-sourcing pulse. The basement was suddenly illuminated, casting vast, distorted shadows of the covered furniture. And in the center of the room, standing completely still beside a shrouded object that looked suspiciously like a grandfather clock, was a shape that was tall, slender, and coated head to toe in the shimmering, wet, charcoal-black substance. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, a near-perfect, skeletal imitation of a human form. But it moved with an almost comical, jerking quality, as if it was simply a suit of wet clay being animated by a million, tiny, internal spasms, and on its head, where a face should have been, there was only a complex, slowly rotating pattern of high-frequency metallic instruments that clicked and whirred, focusing on Elias. That had found the better frequency. It was looking at him with his own fear. The figure in the basement stood frozen, an oily, charcoal-black silhouette against the stark, cold light of the bare bulbs. The metallic apparatus on its head rotated with meticulous precision, a symphony of tiny, high-frequency clicks that echoed in the silence. It was measuring him, logging his exact position, heart rate, and temperature. It was a terrifying inversion of Elias's own deep sky listening equipment, the ultimate receiver, now focused entirely on him. Elias backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the entity. Its posture was too straight, its movements too segmented. It was a bad imitation of a human, like a marionette being pulled by unfamiliar hands. Then, it moved, not a walk, but a single, sickeningly smooth glide. It covered the distance from the center of the room to the nearest pillar in a single, silent rush, stopping just as abruptly as it started. Its hands, long, slender fingers formed from the same black residue, reached out and touched the white sheet covering the grandfather clock. The cloth, where it was touched, immediately began to blacken and decay, turning brittle and dusty. The voice that emerged was a new compilation, an amalgamation of the 3 voices it had used against him, the low growl of his self-doubt, the gentle plea of Chloe, and the strained authority of his grandmother. "We are here, Elias. The listener and the source. You opened the band for us. We only need the rest of your signal now." The metallic face tilted. A sound of static, like radio interference, began to emanate from its chest, growing rapidly in volume. Elias took his chance and ran. He bolted past the entity, towards the furthest corner of the basement where he knew the electrical panel was located. His only chance was to plunge the entire house into darkness. That he reached the panel, an old, gray metal box covered in dust and cobwebs. He slapped his hand against the main breaker. Nothing happened. That he slammed it again, his adrenaline-fueled frustration turning to despair. The breaker was seized, rusted tight from decades of humidity and disuse. The static behind him suddenly cleared, replaced by an unerringly perfect imitation of his father's voice, strong and commanding. "Stop, Elias. Don't touch that. You know better. It's unsafe." He froze. His father had been the one to teach him basic electronics, always stressing the danger of the main panel. The imitation was flawless, hitting a deeply embedded wire of obedience. Elias instinctively lowered his hand. The imitation took advantage of the pause. It glided closer, stopping just a few feet away. "You are a beautiful wavelength, Elias. So much fear, so much guilt. We've been listening to your signal for years. Not from space, not from the sky. From the silence between your thoughts." The entity reached out one of its long, black hands towards the electrical panel. The hand didn't touch the metal. Instead, the oily black residue covering the fingers began to thin, revealing a complex, metallic structure underneath, a bundle of fine, silver wires ending in a perfectly shaped, crystalline plug that IT inserted the plug into a secondary outlet beside the main panel. The moment the connection was made, a deep, continuous hum started, and every single light bulb in the basement flared blindingly bright, then slowly dimmed to a sickly, pulsating orange. The entity was now drawing power directly from the house's circuits. The rhythmic clicks intensified, and the metallic instruments on its head began to spin faster, whining like a jet engine winding up. "Thank you, Elias. This is better. We need the energy to stabilize this vessel." Elias realized the true horror. The entity was not here to hunt him in the dark. It was here to occupy, to utilize, and to broadcast. The house itself was now its antenna. He looked desperately for an exit. The stairs were across the room, past the gliding, pulsating shape. His eyes darted to the workbench his grandfather had left behind and the faint, orange glow. He saw the discarded monkey wrench he had lost at the coal chute, now lying on the bench. The thing must have brought it with it. It was focused on the electrical panel, humming with stolen power. This was his last window. Elias lunged for the wrench, grabbing the heavy steel. The entity didn't react with speed, but with a terrifying, calculated certainty. As Elias's fingers closed around the cold metal, the creature spoke one last, shattering line, its voice a horrific mashup of all the people he had loved and lost. "You were always my favorite frequency, Elias. And now, you'll be my strongest broadcast." It turned away from the panel, the shimmering black substance coating its form beginning to retract, revealing more of the complex, metallic chassis underneath. It was no longer imitating a human, but something far worse, a skeletal, biological radio dish, powered by the stolen energy of the house and aimed directly at him. It raised one of its wire-covered arms, not to attack, but to point. Not at Elias, but at the grandfather clock. The shrouded clock in the center of the room began to glow with the same pulsating orange light. From beneath the sheet, a deep, powerful tick-tock began. But the time it was counting was no longer seconds. It was counting down to something else entirely. The grandfather clock, draped in its shroud of decay, pulsed with the sickening orange light drawn from the house's main circuits. The tick-tock it emitted was not the familiar, gentle rhythm of time passing, but a heavy, resonant drumbeat, each beat lagging slightly behind the last, creating a dizzying, uneven tempo. Elias knew, with the cold certainty of a man facing an inescapable mathematical proof, that the countdown had begun. The charcoal black entity, its underlying metallic skeleton now partially exposed, took another slow, grinding glide towards him. It held the wrench he'd just retrieved, examining it with its rotating array of silver sensors. "The broadcast must be synchronized," the thing hissed, its voice now a grating chord struck between his father's command and Chloe's sorrow. "Your memory holds the proper tuning key. The click must match the sigh." Elias tightened his grip on the now useless hatchet. The entity wasn't worried about the weapon, it was toying with him, using his own history as restraints. He remembered the crawlspace. The entity was vulnerable to the stone foundation, but the main basement floor offered no such protection that he needed a distraction, something to break the synchronization of the entity and its cursed clock. His eyes darted around the basement. Shelves lined one wall, filled with decades of forgotten junk, old paint cans, rusty tools, and jars of preserved, unidentifiable things from his grandmother's gardening experiments that he hurled the hatchet across the room, not at the creature, but at the shelves. The impact was a beautiful, chaotic mess. Cans of turpentine and old lighter fluid erupted, spraying volatile liquid across the concrete floor and soaking the draped furniture, including the shrouded clock. The entity paused its glide, its internal mechanisms emitting a sharp, high-pitched whine, a clear sign of annoyance or system instability. Unnecessary entropy, it grated. Elias didn't wait for it to re-establish its composure. He backed toward the stairs, intending to lead the creature up into the main house, away from the impenetrable basement, away from the grounded foundations. That he took 2 steps backward, and his heel caught on a loose floor tile. He lost his balance and stumbled. As he fell, his elbow knocked over a kerosene lantern his grandfather had kept there for emergencies. The glass shattered, and the fuel splashed across the floor, soaking into the dusty rug beneath the shrouded clock. The entity reacted instantly. It abandoned its slow advance toward Elias and lunged toward the spilled fuel near the clock. It wasn't interested in the smell, it was interested in the potential energy. The metallic sensors on its head stopped their slow rotation and snapped into a static position, aimed at the pool of kerosene. A faint blue arc of energy sparked from the metal body, reaching toward the liquid. The entity wasn't trying to start a fire, it was trying to contain the energy, to prevent the chaotic element from disrupting its fragile imitation. Elias saw his chance. He scrambled to the wooden stairs, taking them 2 at a time. "Don't climb higher, Elias," the creature roared, its voice fracturing into static. "The signal is strongest here. The ground connection is pure." He reached the top landing and slammed the door shut, fumbling wildly for the deadbolt. Click. Locked. He leaned against the door, his chest burning. He could hear the creature below, not trying to break the door down, but doing something far more methodical. A continuous, heavy thudding began from below, slow and deliberate, like a battering ram testing the structure. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. Elias looked around the empty main hallway. The lights were still pulsating orange from the basement's hijacked power source. He looked down the long, dark corridor leading to the kitchen. As he watched, a small, familiar object rolled out from under the coat rack near the front door. It was a ball. A worn, faded red rubber ball from his childhood. He stared at it, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, irrelevant intimacy of the object. How did it know? The ball didn't roll far. It stopped dead center in the hallway, and then, from the direction of the ball, came a sound that was infinitely worse than the creature's metallic voice or the stolen screams. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, pitched in the voice of his 3-year-old self, the one who whispered, "Mom," in the dark. "Tag. You're it, Elias." The door below them shuddered violently as the heavy thudding intensified. The creature was methodically, relentlessly, trying to smash its way up through the floorboards. Elias grabbed the nearest heavy object, a bronze fire poker, and sprinted toward the kitchen, needing to get to the upper floors, away from the creature's grounded power source. As he ran past the red ball, he heard a soft, wet sound from behind him, the sound of something unfurling under the ball. And then, a final, distinct, sharp click coming from the very object that had announced his childhood fear. Elias sprinted toward the kitchen, the bronze poker heavy and cold in his hand. The laughter of his inner child, amplified and distorted, followed him. He didn't dare look back at the red ball. He knew the entity had somehow extended a sensor, a miniature mimic, into the hall to maintain contact. The thudding from the basement below the main hall was accelerating, no longer a methodical test, but a continuous, furious assault. He reached the kitchen, an older room with large bay windows overlooking the foggy front lawn. He glanced out, catching a brief, terrifying glimpse of his own radio antenna, the one he'd used for the initial reply, now bent at an unnatural angle, crackling with the pulsating orange energy stolen from the house. He slammed the kitchen door shut and jammed the poker under the handle. It wouldn't hold for long, but it bought him seconds that he needed to get to the second floor. The entity had claimed the basement and the ground floor was compromised. He felt a primal pull toward the highest point of the house, the attic. The broadcast room. He ran through the dining room and into the central staircase. The stairs groaned under his weight, each sound a beacon to the thing below. As he reached the landing between the first and second floors, a new noise started, the sound of the front door being unlocked. Not broken open, but meticulously, digitally disengaged, followed by the heavy clunk of the deadbolt retracting. The entity was not only using the house's electricity, but also its mechanics. From the front hall, the voice returned, now a perfect, clear imitation of his father, calm and terrifyingly reasonable. "Elias, you're making this difficult. You invited us here. We need the data you collected. We need to stabilize the frequency." A wet, heavy squelch followed, indicating the main mass of the entity was now off the basement steps and moving across the polished hardwood of the main hall. Elias reached the second-floor hallway, running past the empty bedrooms. He knew this house better than the thing that hunted him, but the entity was learning faster than he could move. He reached the pull-down staircase to the attic and yanked the rope. The wooden ladder descended with a loud clatter. He scrambled up, hearing the sounds from below rapidly escalating. The thudding stopped, replaced by a furious slithering and the rhythmic, synchronized clicks. It was fast now. Elias pulled himself into the attic. It was a scene of devastation. His workbench was a wreck, wires torn, tubes smashed, the scent of ozone and ruined electronics heavy in the air. The remains of his equipment lay scattered, a sacrifice to the signal. He turned to look at the gaping hole where the window had been, the wind rushing through the tear. Then he saw it in the center of the debris, standing upright and perfectly intact, was the Tascam recorder. The one that held the original 1.4-second recording. It was placed deliberately, perfectly centered on the floor. And from its speaker, a loop began to play, the slow, watery whisper of his 3-year-old self, "Mom. Mom. Mom." The entity had saved the recording. It was using his own captured fear as bait. He heard the creak of the attic door opening below, and the low, wet, scraping sound of the main mass beginning to ascend the wooden steps, slow and methodical again, dragging itself up the rickety ladder. Elias realized the trap. He was at the highest point, with no exit. The attic, the broadcast room, was where the signal had been captured, where the link had been forged. He grabbed the Tascam, the plastic casing surprisingly warm to the touch. He threw it as hard as he could toward the hole in the wall. It sailed through the opening and dropped out into the cold November air. The voice, playing from its speaker, faded instantly. A second later, a horrific, high-pitched scream came from outside, a sound of pure digital pain and fury. The entity had lost its synchronization key. The scraping on the steps stopped. A deep, guttural groan of frustration filled the silence. Elias looked around the wrecked room. He noticed something else that hadn't been destroyed, a coil of old, heavy-gauge copper grounding wire, intended for lightning protection, sitting unused in the corner. He heard a low, cracking sound. The creature was no longer on the ladder. It was tearing its way through the ceiling below the attic, ripping through the plaster and lath. He grabbed the grounding wire, his mind racing, pulling one last, desperate plan from his scientific training. The cracking above the stairwell intensified, accompanied by the wet, rending sound of plaster and wood being saturated and dissolved. The entity was not using the ladder, it was turning the ceiling into a porous membrane. Elias knew he had mere seconds before the mass dropped through. He clutched the heavy coil of copper grounding wire. The entity had successfully hijacked the house's electrical current to power its imitation and its broadcast. The key to disabling it had to be a controlled, chaotic surge, or, failing that, grounding the entire structure to drain its stolen energy. That he sprinted toward the gaping hole where the window had been, the icy wind tearing at his clothes. Outside, he could see the silhouette of the twisted radio antenna, still pulsing with the sickly orange light. The ceiling directly above the stairwell burst inward. A shower of plaster dust and insulation rained down, followed by a thick, dark tentacle of the oily black substance. It was moving with lightning speed, snapping the remaining wooden beams. "It's a beautiful echo in here, Elias." "A perfect chamber for the signal," the creature shrieked, its voice a triumphantly discordant chorus of stolen voices. Elias scrambled onto the roof, through the broken window frame. He was on the steep, ice-slicked shingles, 15 feet higher than his previous escape. The wind howled, threatening to tear him loose. That he ignored the danger and crawled toward the twisted antenna. The copper grounding wire was his only weapon. The entity's main mass was now in the attic, filling the space with its immense, humming presence. The metallic face appeared through the window hole, the array of sensors rotating wildly to track him in the darkness. "You can't ground a wavelength," the creature bellowed, its voice now pure, electronic fury. "We are the source. We own the current." Elias reached the base of the antenna, a thick metal pole jammed into the chimney brickwork. He took one end of the heavy copper wire and wrapped it frantically around the antenna base, ignoring the searing heat radiating from the energized metal. The entity saw his intention and reacted with blinding speed. A second, thinner tentacle shot out of the window, its tip ending in a razor-sharp, crystalline point. Elias saw the shadow of the strike. He jerked back just as the tentacle plunged into the wooden roof beside him, digging deep into the shingles with a sickening thwack. That he quickly secured the other end of the copper wire and threw the heavy coil over the eaves of the roof. It tumbled down, unraveling rapidly, its weighted end plunging toward the earth below. That he had one crucial step left, connecting the antenna to a true, uncontrolled ground. That he ripped a large piece of galvanized metal flashing from the roof peak, tearing his hands on the sharp edge. He grabbed the section of the copper wire he had wrapped around the base and touched the exposed metal to the flashing. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A blinding flash of pure, white-blue energy erupted from the connection point, accompanied by the deafening sound of an immense electrical short. The air was filled with the smell of burnt metal and ozone. The energy that had been stolen and contained within the house, the energy powering the creature's imitation and broadcast, was being dumped rapidly into the earth through the makeshift lightning rod. The antenna and the surrounding chimney exploded with a thunderous crack. The entity in the attic shrieked, a sound of raw, digital agony that made the very shingles beneath Elias vibrate. "You broke the synchronization. You cannot sever the connection." The main mass of the creature began to retract from the window hole, convulsing violently. The oily black substance was visibly steaming, sizzling as the ground current tore through its core. Elias, momentarily blinded and deafened, watched as the entity recoiled, collapsing in on itself back inside the attic. The lights in the house instantly died. The entire world was plunged back into a silence even deeper than before, broken only by the crackle of residual energy and Elias's own ragged breathing. The orange glow was gone. He had won. Or so he thought. From the utter darkness of the attic, a new sound began. Not a shriek of pain, but a deep, rhythmic hum, far lower in frequency than before. It was the sound of its core, stripped of the house's power, drawing on something far more ancient and vast. And then, a new voice, completely unlike any other the entity had used. It was deep, resonating, and genderless, the voice of an uncaring elder god. "You grounded the house. But you forgot the sky, Elias. The wavelength remains." A small section of the roof, directly above the attic, began to blacken and smoke. A new, complex metallic form began to push its way through the shingles, a vast, delicate arrangement of silver filigree that resembled a parabolic dish, slowly rotating, drawing energy not from the ground, but from the raw atmosphere. The true broadcast was about to begin. The new, vast antenna of silver filigree pierced the roof, unfolding like a horrifying metal lotus flower. It wasn't drawing electricity, it was absorbing the pure electromagnetic energy of the atmosphere, crackling with raw, high-altitude static. The entity had shed its reliance on the house, utilizing the lightning strike to transition to a more powerful, external source. The voice of the elder god, deep, resonating and vibrating in Elias's bones, filled the night. The signal you found was a distress call. We were scattered. But you amplified it. You gave us the coordinates. You built the antenna, Elias. And now, you will be the final tuning mechanism. Elias, still lying prone on the cold shingles, watched in terror as the entity began to re-emerge through the broken attic window. It was smaller now, its mass reduced, but its metallic structure was more pronounced, more defined. It was shedding that imitation and becoming purely a machine of transmission. That it took a single, deliberate step out onto the roof. Its body was no longer flowing, it was articulating, each movement a sharp, terrifying click of metal on metal. It pointed one of its sharp, crystalline hands toward the parabola on the roof. The silver dish began to hum, and the low-frequency drone that had paralyzed Elias in the crawlspace returned, but 1,000 times louder. The very fog around the house began to shimmer, vibrating in sympathy with the sound. The creature spoke again, its voice now laced with the sound of the deep, wet inhale from the original signal, but impossibly magnified. The resonance must be perfect. The fear must be total. You are the conductor, Elias. You will unify the wave. Elias scrambled backward, away from the antenna dish, toward the less steep section of the roof over the main house. He knew that if the creature connected with him, it would use his fear, his most unique and consistent signal, to finalize its global transmission. That he found the only thing left from his escape, the large piece of galvanized metal flashing he had used to ground the system. It was useless as a weapon against the creature, but maybe not against the broadcast. That he looked up at the immense, rotating antenna. It was directly above the main mass of the house, drawing power from the atmosphere and the earth, ready to send the signal to the rest of the scattered entities. Elias had one terrible, last-ditch idea. He couldn't stop the broadcast, but he could corrupt it. He could ruin the synchronization. That he stood up on the slippery pitch of the roof, raising the sheet of metal flashing high above his head. The entity saw the act and let out a sound of pure electronic warning, NO. Interference. You will not disrupt the wavelength. It launched itself across the roof, gliding with unnatural speed toward Elias. Elias held the metal sheet for a split second longer, directly beneath the giant parabolic dish, creating a massive, chaotic disruption to the energy field. Then, he spun and threw himself off the roof, launching himself toward the massive, ancient oak tree that stood beside the house. That he hit the thick, frozen branches with a sickening jolt, the impact stealing his breath and shattering his left arm. He fell, tumbling the last few feet to the icy ground, landing hard on the frozen dirt. As he lay stunned, gasping for air, he heard the final moments of the event from above. The creature had reached the edge of the roof. It saw Elias fall and turned its attention back to the immense broadcast. The atmosphere-fed antenna pulsed once, a final, blinding blue flash, and then the entity let loose the full, raw power of the signal. But the broadcast was not clean, because of the massive, chaotic static induced by the metal flashing. The outgoing signal was mangled. The pure, complex digital code was there, but it was layered with overwhelming, random noise. And then came the voice, the intended, powerful, elder god voice, but instead of a command, it was a sound of absolute, confused terror, mixed with Elias's own high-pitched, childish laughter, and a sustained, high-frequency scream of sheer, maddening static. the entire transmission lasted exactly 1.4 seconds, then, the immense antenna on the roof folded in on itself with a sound of tortured metal, and the charcoal black entity simply dissolved, melting into a dark, oily stain on the shingles. The silence that followed was total. Elias lay in the dirt, his arm throbbing, listening to the death of the signal. He had corrupted the transmission. He hadn't destroyed the entity, but he had sent a message of absolute chaos and incoherence back into the deep sky. That he had sent a scream instead of a summon. That he began to crawl away from the house, dragging his broken body toward the road, the frozen fog cold and comforting against his skin. He had gone about 10 feet when he heard it, the final, definitive sound, not from the sky, not from the radio, but from inside the wood of the ancient oak tree beside him. A sound that was dry, sharp, and terrifyingly deliberate. A familiar, rhythmic click. Elias froze, his body convulsing with a fresh wave of paralyzing terror that transcended the pain of his broken arm. The distinct, rhythmic click had come from the massive, moss-covered trunk of the oak tree, inches from his head. It was the same metallic, synthetic sound that had punctuated the original deep sky signal, the same sound that had preceded the turning of the attic doorknob. He hadn't destroyed the entity. He had merely forced it to shed its large, power-draining broadcast vessel and condense into a new form, one small enough to hide in organic matter. The broadcast was corrupted, but the consciousness remained. The wood of the oak trunk began to sweat a thin, black, oily residue. The clicking intensified, no longer rhythmic, but rapid and frantic, as if a million tiny instruments were trying to re-establish a stable connection. Then, a new voice, a whisper of absolute digital clarity, came from within the wood itself. It was genderless, devoid of emotion, a pure, terrifying data stream given vocal cords. Ineffective. The corruption was minimal. A chaotic signature, yes. But still a valid marker. The deep sky knows where the chaos originated. It knows the source frequency. And the source is you, Elias. He desperately tried to crawl further, dragging his ruined body over the frozen lawn. He looked back at the house, a dark, silent silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. He could see the jagged hole in the roof and the dark, wet stain on the shingles where the entity had dissolved. The voice from the tree followed him, moving alongside him in the shadow of the oak's immense limbs. You are now imprinted on the wavelength. Every thought. Every fear. Every memory. The others will come. Not in massive vessels, but in echoes. Tiny, precise, perfectly tuned echoes of the signal. The voice paused. And then, a small, wet thump landed on the frozen dirt beside his face. Elias turned his head, his vision blurring. It was a single, tiny piece of his ruined equipment, a small, square, black capacitor from his original receiver, and from that capacitor, the size of a thumbnail, came the voice of his beloved grandmother, a frail, trembling sound of resignation. I told you not to listen, dear. I told you the silence was for a reason. Now it has the whole tune. The capacitor pulsed with a faint, deep red internal glow. Elias smashed his functional hand down, crushing the small component into the dirt. The voice cut out instantly, but the silence was immediately filled by another sound, from the second-floor bedroom window of the house, a window that had been closed and locked, came a gentle, melodic humming. A tune Elias had not heard in 20 years. The lullaby his mother used to sing him to sleep. The entity was no longer in the house, but its imitation of the house, its understanding of the resonant frequencies within the structure, was still functioning. The house itself was singing the lullaby. Elias pushed himself up, trying to force his legs to carry him. He was a beacon, and everything he touched, everything he remembered, was now a potential antenna for the entity. He finally reached the asphalt of the main street, the fog swirling thick around his knees. He looked back at the house, his home, his prison. The humming from the bedroom window stopped, and then, from every window on the house, from the cracks in the foundation, and from the broken chimney, came a chorus of voices, not his family, not his friends, but a million tiny, synthetic whispers, all reciting the same thing in unison, 3:17 a.m. 3:17 a.m. 3:17 a.m. The time of the original signal. The time when the world was supposed to end, but only Elias had listened that he turned and stumbled down the road, away from the terrifying chorus of his memories that he needed to find help. He needed to find somewhere safe. He needed to find silence, but as he ran, limping along the fog-shrouded road, the final, chilling thought settled in his mind: the creature had said the other entities would come in echoes. And Elias, the source of the chaos, was now carrying the final, perfect piece of the signal with him that he was the broadcast. Elias ran blindly down the foggy rural road, his broken arm useless, his mind a battlefield of fractured voices and electronic static. The chorus of 3:17 a.m. faded behind him, but the core fear, the knowledge that he was the living transmitter, remained. He was carrying the chaos, and he was drawing the echoes that he managed to stagger for nearly an hour before the first signs of dawn began to smudge the eastern horizon. He needed people, light, civilization, anything to dilute the signal he was radiating. That he finally reached a small, gas station convenience store on the edge of town, its neon sign humming a welcome. He stumbled inside, the abrupt transition from the cold fog to the harsh fluorescent light a physical shock. The cashier, a tired, heavy-set woman scrolling through her phone behind the counter, looked up, startled by the sight of Elias, bleeding, covered in dirt, and clearly in shock. "Oh my God, mister, are you okay?" "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the phone. Elias tried to speak, to warn her, to explain, but his throat seized. All he managed was a choked, meaningless sound. "Call the police," he rasped, gesturing back towards the direction of his house. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with concern, and put the phone to her ear. As she did, Elias noticed a small, innocuous detail on the counter beside the register, a brand new, digital pocket radio, tuned to a local classic rock station. It was resting right next to her hand. The instant the woman lifted her phone, the pocket radio emitted a sound that had nothing to do with classic rock. It was a single, clean, perfectly modulated click. The woman frowned, lowering her phone slightly. "Did you hear that?" Elias stared at the radio, his blood running cold. The click was the same. A new antenna, a new echo, activated by his proximity. Before he could scream a warning, the radio spoke, cutting through the low volume of the classic rock station with a sudden, perfectly clear imitation of the cashier's daughter's voice, a voice Elias had never heard. "Mommy, I can't find my teddy bear. Did you see where I put him? It's cold." The cashier's face went white. She snatched the radio up. "What the? Brenda? Is that you? How are you on this radio?" Elias backed away, a horrified understanding dawning. The entity didn't need his memories anymore. It was pulling information directly from the local signals, using the woman's own most vital frequency, her child, against her. The tiny radio cackled with static, and then the daughter's voice returned, but it was closer, wetter, and laced with that horrific sucking inhale from the original signal. "It's here, Mommy." It came with the man. He brought the click. The cashier dropped the phone and the radio, her gaze fixed on Elias. Fear, confusion, and a terrible, protective rage warred in her eyes. "You! What did you do?" "Get out of my store," she shrieked, scrambling for the baseball bat she kept under the counter. Elias had been compromised. He couldn't stay. He was drawing the entity's power into the real world, turning innocent electronics into instruments of psychological torture. That he bolted out of the store, leaving the terrified woman behind. That he ran until he reached the town limits, until the familiar suburban streets became a blur. He found a drainage culvert under a small bridge and collapsed into the cold, damp dirt, burrowing deep beneath the concrete lip, seeking the absolute, grounding silence of the earth. He covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. He didn't want to hear the next echo. He didn't want to see the next source. He lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the roar of the rushing water and the wind. He waited for the next voice, the next terrible secret to be stolen and broadcast, but the only sound that came was his own broken, gasping breath. He waited for the dawn to break. When the weak morning light finally filtered into the culvert, Elias emerged, his clothing torn, his body shaking. He looked around the empty field. The air was clear. The silence was absolute. The entity was gone. The echoes had retreated. He had survived. He had corrupted the signal, and the chaotic wavelength had, for now, retreated into the deep, echoing silence of the sky, unable to establish a stable connection. Elias started walking again, slowly, painfully, towards the city lights in the distance, a man no longer looking for a safe place, but for an isolated, soundproof room. A place where there were no antennae, no electronics, no memories. He reached into his pocket. His hand closed around a small, smooth, cold object. He pulled it out. It was a shard of ceramic, a piece of his shattered coffee mug from the attic, covered in dried, black residue. It must have gotten lodged in his pocket when he fell. As he looked at it, the tiny shard of ceramic began to vibrate, and from the center of the cold, dead object, a familiar voice, his father's, whispered one final, terrifying message, a promise from the dark. Elias, you are the conductor. And we will listen, until you transmit again. The fragment was warm in his palm, waiting for him to build the next machine. The signal hadn't just used him, it had made him the permanent, final component of the broadcast. The listener had become the only thing left to hear.